Okay, so I said in my, I don't know which lecture it was. It was one of the modernism lectures. I think um, maybe the one on cubism. Anyway, I said that I'd give you my kind of broad spectrum, five broad sweeping categories for all of art, which is something that this is a lecture that I generally give in my art appreciation class at the beginning of the semester, which helps students kind of get acquainted with the big picture idea about art. But I think it also is something to keep in mind and is kind of helpful when we're looking at art history, as we, particularly in modernism, look at all these different overlapping movements. It's kind of grounding and helpful to have some basic categories to file things that we're looking at under. So this is what I call the Isms lecture. Okay, so in my mind, and I'm not the only person that thinks this, these are common kind of categories that are used for art history in general, and there's many movements that fit within each of these. Basically, the idea is that these five broad categories, you can put subsets of all the other movements in art history under these five areas. And some movements kind of have a toe in multiple pools and in multiple categories. So with these five and combinations therein, you should be able to kind of better group and understand all of the work that we talk about in this class. Okay, so my first illustration here is a diagram by Alfred H. Barr Jr. He was the first director of the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I ran across this diagram in a book I was reading, and I just thought it was kind of, it's kind of funny. I mean, it just looks a little crazy and nutty, right? So avoiding the crazy nuttiness is why I try to kind of simplify this a little bit, just so we have sort of a broad spectrum to think about. So the five that I kind of break things down into are realism, expressionism, formalism, instrumentalism, and conceptualism. Okay, realism, and I put these kind of in the order that they come up chronologically, but also the order in which they're easiest to understand, in my opinion. So, in this case, realism, which is sometimes also called naturalism, it's a little confusing when I bring it up now in our Art History 2 class because we talked about a specific movement that was in the 19th century that was called realism. So that's kind of a specific thing. This is like big picture realism, which we can also call naturalism. Basically, this is work that is accurate, it's detailed, it's unembellished, and it's just a depiction of what we see in the world as we see it. So it's trying to mimic what we encounter with our senses in the natural world. It's illusionistic. It's trying to accurately represent the world around us. An example of a subset, something that you would categorize under this, is hyperrealism. The image I provide to illustrate this is not a photograph, this is a painting, an oil painting by Gerhard Richter. He's a contemporary German artist. This is from 1994. And you can see that it's a very, very realistic portrayal of a young woman called Lucinda. Okay, realism. Pretty easy, right? So the next one, we start talking about kind of, in this class we talk about it in a couple of different places. We really get into it once we get into post-impressionism, I think, but it's brought up a few times before. The earliest time that I kind of get into it is with El Greco, if you remember all the way back to then. So basically, the criterion for success for Expressionism is, does it express the artist's feeling? So it's a super subjective criterion for success, which makes it sort of inaccessible to some people, but also sometimes the most accessible because it tends to be pretty colorful and have a lot of, you can kind of get into the feeling of the work. And people, a lot of popular artists that people are drawn to tend to fit into this category. So basically, the artist seeks to express their emotional content, they express their emotional personal experiences, their inner thoughts and feelings. A confusing thing is a lot of works from the movement Abstract Expressionism, which we are going to talk about soon as it is a part of modernism, don't really fit in this category. They actually kind of tend to fit under formalism, which we'll talk about in a minute. As I said, basically a lot of the work that fits in this category is very colorful. It doesn't have to be colorful. Sometimes it's not. Um, and tends to have expressive brushstrokes. A subset example would be German Expressionism. Van Gogh tends to be put in this category. Okay, formalism. When we're talking about formalism, if you go the philosophical route, the whole branch of aesthetics in philosophy is about formalism. It's basically an assessment, a criterion of success is what the art is made of and if it is being true to its form. Okay, so it's art for art's sake. It's a study of art by analyzing and comparing form, material, and style. So when we start talking about artists in the 19th century starting to become aware of the surface of the canvas and thinking about the fact that they're making a two-dimensional representation of something and being more aware of the materiality of what they're working with, those are formalistic kind of notions and ideas. Someone that we're going to talk about when we talk about modernism and when we talk about abstract expressionism is Clement Greenberg. So he was an art critic, and he kind of formed a lot of the criteria and the theory, and also a lot of the scholarship about what we define as formalism in America, particularly American 20th century art. So sometimes formalism is discussed in art history as Greenbergian modernism, named after Clement Greenberg. So basically, the compositional elements, the elements of art, line, color, shape, texture, those kind of things, the things that we can perceive easily, are the primary focus of the work. So those attributes take precedence over the subject, they take precedence over any kind of message, they take precedence over anything that you're trying to express. So it's basically just what the painting actually is, formalism. A subset example of this would be color field painting, which is kind of part of abstract expressionism, so we'll talk about that. Okay, this is a painting by Helen Frankenthaler called Canal, and she is a soak stain painter. She worked on raw canvas on the floor and then poured the paint directly onto the canvas. So it's all about the process. She's very much a process artist. Okay, instrumentalism. This is another name that comes to us from philosophy. Particularly instrumentalism, the word comes from the philosophy of John Dewey. So if you have an interest in philosophy, you could look up John Dewey. Basically, it's that the truth or the success of an idea, or in our case, an artwork, work of art, is determined by its success in the active solution of a problem. Okay, so this is art that serves a purpose outside of itself. It's kind of the opposite of formalism. It's art with an agenda, so like political art, art that's didactic, art that tries to teach us something specific. A subset example is social practice work, which we'll talk about a little later in the semester. But an example of social practice work is this advertisement made by the artist group Grand Fury in the 80s. They worked with another group called Act Up, and they were doing these kind of works and installations and these sort of advertisement-like works like this one to spread awareness about HIV and AIDS. Okay. And then the trickiest one to kind of grasp is conceptualism, which is more often called concept art. And this is artwork where the idea involved in the work takes precedence over the formal, the technical, the naturalistic, the material, or the expressive concerns. So the idea that you have behind the work, not the visual subject, but just the idea of what you're trying to get across, is the primary thing you're focused on, not so much how you make it or how you portray it or what materials you use or whether it's expressing your emotions. It's what the thought is behind what the impetus of the work is. Most performance art fits under this category. Also a lot of word art, like Jenny Holzer, a lot of that kind of work fits under this category. This example, this is several film stills from Anna Mendieta, who we'll talk about later, from her film Sweating Blood. Okay, so that was pretty quick, but that's just like a rundown of the the five big isms, the big categories of art that I like to have as a handy sort of reference when talking about art history. Okay,